My name is Meredith Miller, and I'm the Vice President for Trade, Energy, and Economics and Director of NBR's D.C. office. For the next part of our program, we're going to focus in on the essential role of Congress in formulating strong U.S. foreign and economic policy. In particular, we're going to be discussing a new NBR analysis, Aftershock, the 112th Congress, and Post-Crisis Asia. As Rich mentioned earlier this morning, NBR was founded in the legacy of Senator Scoop Jackson from Washington State. Senator Jackson was a very strong advocate for bipartisan foreign policy, believing that is the most durable and the most reflective of the interests of the American people. And it was with that in mind that we approached Ed Gresser and Dan Twining to ask that they build on the excellent analysis they did for us of the 111th Congress and the Asia foreign policy landscape. And what Ed and Dan did is put their heads together in less than 12,000 words, summed up the central issues that they saw facing our current Congress and the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. I hope you'll agree with me that it's an excellent piece, and I think it really underscores the importance of having an engaged, bipartisan, and far-sighted congressional approach to safeguarding the interests of the United States in Asia. So I'd also just like to mention that we're very fortunate to have Ed and Dan in that they both have deep expertise in the region, but they also have a lot of policymaking experience. Ed Gresser is the director of the nonprofit Progressive Institute. He worked for Senator Baucus. He also served at USTR when Charlene Barshefsky was there during the Clinton administration. Dan Twining is the senior Asia policy advisor at the German Marshall Fund, and he served Senator McCain in the Senate and in the Bush administration in the policy planning office. So I want to thank you both again for your work on this piece. We're going to start out the panel discussion by asking Ed and Dan to share with us some of their thoughts on what's changed since the 111th Congress in terms of the landscape in Asia, which has shifted fairly significantly, as well as the makeup of our own congressional representation here in the U.S. and in the context of the global recession. We'll then hear from three senior Hill staff who have generously carved time out of a very busy schedule on the Hill this week to share with us their perspective as on-the-ground practitioners of what we'll be discussing. We'll first hear from Bryce Dussman. Bryce has served in both the House and the Senate, and he's the Chief of Staff for Congressman Reichert from Washington State, who's leading efforts in the House on passage of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and serves on the House Ways and Means Committee. We'll then hear from Isaac Edwards. Isaac is Republican counsel for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He has been deeply engaged in the energy implications of the tsunami and the earthquake which struck Japan, including the briefing that the committee held yesterday on nuclear power. And last but not least, we'll hear from Frank Giannuti. Frank joined us in 2009, and he had some of the most memorable lines for me from that discussion, so I'm looking forward to what you have to say today, Frank. Frank is the Policy Director for East Asian and Pacific Affairs on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for the Democratic staff. Before I turn the floor over to Ed, I'd just like to remind everyone that all of our respondents' remarks are off the record, so if anyone has recording or video going, we ask that you turn that off immediately following Ed and Dan's opening remarks and keep it off for the duration of the session, and do not quote any of our senior Hill staffers. We want to have a frank and free-flowing discussion, so we promised them that they could let their hair down. So thank you very much, and with that, Ed, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Meredith. Thank you for this opportunity to write for NBR. Thank you all for coming. Let me also say it has, as always, been a great pleasure to work with Dan for his depth of insight, his knowledge of the region in general and of South Asia in particular, and because he's such an easy person to work with, and so readily able to talk over different emphases, reshape things that neither of us felt quite right about. We've wound up, as we did 2 years ago, with a report that is really a joint project that both of us feel responsible for each word and are willing to back up, each sentence. So it has been a great experience again, and I'm very grateful to NBR for inviting us to do so. Let me start my brief presentation with a quote that I'm drawing from page 12 of our report. This is not something that Dan or I wrote, but an observation of a group called the Human Security Project, which is a research group at Simon Fraser University in Canada. This observes that over the past 3 decades, East Asia has undergone an extraordinary transformation. From 1946 to the end of the 1970s, it was the most war-racked region in the world. Today, it is enjoying the most broadly peaceful era in its history. It has been free of international conflict for almost 2 decades, and is now one of the least violent regions in the international system. This is really an extraordinary accomplishment. It owes much to the wisdom of governments around the region. It also, I think, has 2 really important pillars. And the fundamental question I think we're trying to pose in this report is whether one or perhaps both of those pillars are at risk of erosion. And second, the fact, I believe, that the decisions this Congress will make are really decisive in making sure those pillars do not erode in 2 ways. One, a sort of choice that's before the Congress that everyone is well aware of. A second that may be made by default and perhaps without realizing the long-term consequences it might have. Why do we sort of ask whether these pillars are in danger of erosion? One of the pillars, which the Fraser Institute or the Fraser University report notes, is that in the late 1970s, China made a strategic decision to give up sort of revolutionary orientation, integrate itself with the mainstream of the Asia-Pacific economy, and see its future development and growth and power as part of this larger, rapidly growing space of humanity. The second pillar is that over the 1960s and 70s and 80s, the United States built up a network of policies, alliances with the most powerful Asian economies, forward military presence, commitment to protect stability, to safeguard sea lanes, all those sorts of things that we take for granted, to have a very active economic role in the region. And those 2 factors, the policy decision of China and the commitment of the United States and its allies, have, I think, together enabled this era of long Asian peace to emerge to the great benefit of the people of the region and also to the great benefit of the United States when you think about what sorts of policies we had to follow in the 40s and 50s and 60s and how stressful and damaging they were here and how difficult life had been for the people of Asia. We offer this report now at the end of a period of crisis. Over the past couple of years, the U.S. has been badly damaged, very high unemployment rate unrivaled since the 1970s, some damage to the image of the United States as an economy. China and India, the 2 rising powers, have come through this crisis very successfully, only very small dips in growth. And as the crisis seems to be fading, China seems to have emerged from it with a somewhat different orientation than it had had before the crisis era. It has gained a large share of the world economy, up from 11% to about 12.5%. It is becoming a not only industrial power, but scientific and technological power. If you look at statistics on research and development, on patent filings, all these sorts of things, and is obviously very conscious of this new place in the world. One of the effects of this consciousness seems to have been a disposition to kind of challenge the existing arrangements in ways that we hadn't seen in a while, to take a very strong and forward position on maritime issues, to side more closely with North Korea in the aftermath of clashes between North Korea and South Korea, the sinking of the Cheonan, the shelling of the Young Island. Clashes also with the European Union over climate change, with the Nobel Prize Committee over the Peace Prize award last year. has raised questions in my mind, and I think in Dan's mind, and maybe in many people's mind, about whether the Chinese foreign policy is in the midst of a transformation or is in the midst of a domestic debate. These are not, I would say, these less favorable trends are not universal. I would say that when China's attitude toward Afghanistan does not seem to have changed, has not been a big challenge of the U.S. role there. But it has raised questions for both of us about whether this pillar of security and stability and peace in Asia has eroded a bit over the past couple of years. That raises some questions for the United States, of course, and the role of Congress, I think, is especially important as we answer them in two places. One is that within this coming year, we will make a decision on whether to pass the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement or not. Purely as a matter of trade policy, this is a very big agreement. Korea is an economic partner about on the scale of France, a little bit beneath the United Kingdom, but a major trade partner, a major investor in the United States, major research and science partner, education partner, and, of course, one of the major Asian treaty allies of the United States. To pass the KORUS, Dan and I believe, is a sign of American confidence in this relationship and a signal to the Asian community generally that the U.S. will be engaged in Asia, that we will remain a leading part of the economic evolution of the Asia-Pacific, and that when the President of the United States signs an agreement and appears with his partner at signing ceremonies, you can be sure that the United States will follow through. This can be followed up by the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has a lot of promise as a kind of early architecture for next generation of American economic relations in the Pacific. But it is fundamental, I think, that the KORUS pass, because if it does not, then I think most of our trade diplomacy in Asia will be called into question, and that will last for a long time. Second choice Congress will make is one that is not, I think, so much at the top of people's minds, but at least not directly. If you look at the Washington Post today or those sorts of American news, you'll see continual clashes over taxation and budget issues. We are entering a period of fiscal contraction. This will amount, in the end, it will require some amount of spending cuts, some amount of changes in taxation, some amount of retirement policy shifts, and some changes in our military budgeting. The atmosphere of polarization and sort of cross-party fighting and bitterness over this can lead to decisions that are either not very well thought through or not thought through in the long term. Dan and I believe that it is very important that whatever decisions we make, whatever the mix of taxation and spending and entitlement, all these different sorts of issues, Congress should think through the commitments we have under our alliances with Japan, with Korea, with the Philippines and Thailand, with Australia and New Zealand, should think through the growing sort of uncertainty about maritime issues and the importance of our naval role, should think through the apparently growing sort of boldness and violence of North Korea, and make sure that whatever decisions are made about our future budget, we remain able to fulfill our commitments in the alliances and remain able to play our role as a guarantor of security. Because I feel that the two pillars of Asia's law and peace, China's orientation toward integration, growth, development at home, the ability of the U.S. and its allies to maintain a stable environment generally, are closely interlinked. And if that second pillar of our commitment under these alliances begins to erode, it may be that other guarantors of security will erode as well, and this era of law and peace that has been so good for Asia and so good for the United States may come into some question. We do not believe that is at all inevitable. There are definitely ways we can manage our budgeting and our decisions on long-term spending and military and taxation issues that don't put our role in jeopardy. But if we make these decisions without forethought, without thinking through their implications, we could inadvertently make decisions we'll come to regret. That, I think, is sort of the basic question we're trying to raise in this report. And Dan will speak to some of these issues in a bit more detail. And thank you very much again to Meredith, to NBR, and to all of you for coming.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks very much to NBR, to Rich and Meredith and everybody. It's really delightful to be back with you. I really appreciate Ed's point about how easygoing I am. If you could let my wife know that, I'd really appreciate it, actually. Ed and I are products of the time when bipartisanship up here on the Hill was fashionable. And I think, sort of speaking for myself anyway, I think we certainly hope it continues to come back into fashion here. Asia policy itself, luckily, is particularly nonpartisan, I would argue, if we kind of do it right. That doesn't, however, mean that it's not complicated. It also doesn't mean that the status quo that's governed U.S. policy in this region, really for 60 years, is any longer sufficient. Certainly, we'd argue it's necessary, but changing balances of power, changing globalization fault lines, and all of these sorts of things suggest to us that you really need, in addition to the kind of continuity of the U.S. alliance system, strong U.S. economic leadership in this region, and other things that really, again, have a good bipartisan history. We also need to be taking on some of these hard questions that Ed raised. And they're hard questions around the U.S. budget dynamic in the kind of short, medium, and long terms. They're also hard questions about whether our current posture in Asia itself is sustainable, and do we actually need to be this is speaking for myself, but do we actually almost need to be revisionist in kind of pushing forward boundaries on issues like diversifying where we base U.S. troops and supplies in the region, how we think about different countries and alliances and institutions in the region. I'd love to just run down very quickly, because I'm keen to hear from our congressional colleagues, a couple key issues. The first, of course, our report was written before the tragedy, disaster in Japan. But there are an interesting set of questions that come out of Japan's hopeful return, renaissance in the wake of this awful set of catastrophes, in terms of possibly a different outlook for Japanese politics, possibly a different outlook for Japan's foreign policy in the region. These are not short-term questions, but really longer-term. But I think any assessment of the region, certainly in security terms, needs to begin with the U.S.-Japan alliance and really to think about what does the Fukushima crisis mean in terms of when Japan comes out of it, renewing and re-energizing that alliance. A second point, of course, Ed already mentioned, and it's very present to all of us, is this question about about China's new assertiveness. Whether we could spend all day talking about whether this is part of kind of a leadership transition dynamic, whether this is an assessment of Chinese power by Chinese stakeholders that is rather inflated, whether this is a new look to Chinese foreign and security policy or something that has been kind of underlying it for many years but is really now becoming more acute. But as we look around at kind of China's maritime assertiveness, at some of the, frankly, bullying that's gone on with relation to Japanese forces in contested waters and in Japan's home waters, whether we look at Chinese relations with Southeast Asian friends of ours, with India, China's reach into the Indian Ocean, all of these raise very critical questions for U.S. congressmen and senators about not only funding American defense commitments in Asia, but in thinking about our global role and what it means to be challenged in a way that I think many Americans are simply not used to, certainly when it comes from a great power rather than from an asymmetric terrorist threat or otherwise. So our sense was that congressional debates, certainly about our defense posture, about new technologies for power projection, new defense capabilities will be quite critical in the context of really some very hard fiscal choices facing the Congress. A third point is around India. President Obama, after a sort of rocky first year and a half in U.S. relations with India under his tenure, went to India in November, had a very successful visit, called for Indian Security Council membership. This raises a set of issues for Congress to deal with over the next 2 years, including further liberalization of American export controls, deepening of defense cooperation, the possibility of a bilateral investment treaty and other forms of more institutionalized economic cooperation. It also raises the stakes for India in terms of its foreign policy choices. And I think India disappointed a lot of its American friends with its abstention on the UN Security Council vote on Libya. As Iran comes back into focus, Iranian proliferation activities, India is going to have to reconcile its old relationship with Iran with its new relationship with the United States. And folks up here will be paying very close attention to this. Fourth, Indonesia. Without spending a lot of time, Asia's other rising giant that not everybody pays enough attention to. Certainly, again, a priority of President Obama, an important congressional role in terms of capacity building and really trying to institutionalize a partnership that everybody seems to want in principle, but that we need to figure out how to actually operationalize. Afghanistan. More American forces died or wounded in Afghanistan in 2010 than in any year since 2001. However, General Petraeus and our other military commanders arguing that we've turned the corner, that this counterinsurgency strategy is working. Big questions for the Hill about whether we can sustain our focus on not only the security side in Afghanistan as we look towards a transition in 2014, but whether the commitment to high levels of civilian assistance, institution building, can sustain themselves. And this feeds into the perhaps more interesting and worrisome conversation about Pakistan, and worrisome not because of what Americans are saying, but what's happening on the ground in Pakistan. First, for both Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Arab revolutions have raised really interesting questions about how and where the United States should be spending its foreign assistance dollars. One can make an argument. I'm not going to make it, but one can imagine how candidly and persuasively one could make the argument that helping Egypt build a new democracy, for instance, is the new most important mission out there, and that our efforts in Afghanistan and Pakistan should be ramped down accordingly. There's also a particular set of questions around Pakistan, which is, again, in the context of the Arab awakening, is Pakistan, these questions about whether Pakistan's an ally or adversary, the relationship of the Pakistani security establishment to the Afghan Taliban, broadly defined, and forces killing Americans in Afghanistan. Questions about Pakistan's own lack of commitment to reform, some of the internal dynamics at play in Pakistan in terms of increasing intolerance of dissent, increasing intolerance of minorities, a democracy that really doesn't look a lot more institutionalized than it did 2 years ago. And then there are a set of course, specific questions around China's determination to build several new nuclear reactors in Pakistan, of all places. The sustainability, in the context of all of these issues, the sustainability of U.S. civilian assistance to Pakistan, the historic Kerry Lugar legislation enacted in the last Congress, I think very much in question. Almost through, just wanted to mention North Korea, which Ed also mentioned. Very much in the news last year, perhaps gone more quiet, but I think if we assess North Korea's new sharp-elbowed approach to South Korea, the sinking of the Cheonan, the shelling of South Korean territory for the first time in decades, we can understand this in terms of the leadership transition underway in Pyongyang, which is not yet completed by any measure, and which suggests that we should expect to see more strategic surprises rather than fewer. This, again, at a time when we're all preoccupied with Libya, with Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Finally, just to reiterate what Ed said, the important macro question, really the underlying macro question for this Congress, is this question about sustaining American deterrent capabilities in Asia, sustaining American leadership as a Pacific power, as the preeminent Pacific power, not in any kind of unilateral way, but through old allies, new partnerships. Big questions about our ability to manage quite a comprehensive set of challenges in the region, arguably a more comprehensive and complicated set of challenges than we faced in Asia for quite some time. And we did conclude in the report that really the best single thing Congress could do, in addition to kind of remaining committed, is taking on these fiscal challenges in the United States to make sure that our country is in a position to continue to lead and shape the world's emerging center of wealth and power. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed and Dan, for laying out so thoughtfully in the analysis and here today the really daunting array of complex decisions facing our Congress and the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. We're now moving into the part of our panel that's off the record. And Bryce, I'd like to ask you to start us off.
Okay.
Thank you.